welcome everyone. Let me turn it over now to Rui for our first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Rina, for the invitation and for the opportunity to take part of this meeting. Thank you a lot. Well, I'm gonna read. If the pace of my reading is too fast, basically raise your hand and I can slow a little bit, okay? So let's start. Around the world, people are bored in quarantine, but not in Brazil. Here, politics have accelerated in the frantic pace, led by a potentially suicidal president. Unlike Orban or Erdogan, Bolsonaro did not take advantage of the pandemic to concentrate the power and restrict civil liberties. Instead, he seeks to enhance support for his moral and political agenda, an inverted revolution in the fashion of neo-fascism. Let's review the context briefly. After a successful decade in which modest improvements for those from below combined with the usual privilege of those from above, Lulism lost traction. By Lulism, we understand a mode of regulation of class conflict that engaged the passive consent of the subaltern classes to a government led by a trade union bureaucracy entrenched in the state, which ensure modest but effective concessions to workers. A decade of relative social pacification ensued against the backdrop of economic growth fueled by the commodity supercycle. However, the conjunction of the June 2013 days, the largest cycle of mass demonstration in Brazil's history, corruption scandals, and economic recession, shifted the ruling class's approach from inclusive neoliberalism to social dispossession and from conciliation to class warfare. This is the background to Lula's successor Dilma Rousseff's deposition in 2016, Lula's arrest, and Bolsonaro's victory in 2018. For those from above, Bolsonaro offers the framework of authoritarian neoliberalism, which is the policy state. Without a program of his own, he outsourced the management of the economy to a genuine Chicago boy, Paulo Guedes. As a feeling, he advances a nitrograde behavioral, cultural, and scientific agenda, which the elite tolerates but considers distasteful. Its support for the former captain is a marriage of convenience, as it ideally seeks Bolsonarism without Bolsonaro. However, Bolsonaro has ideas of his own, a dynasty with the military as its party and the evangelicals as its social base. In order to understand popular support he enjoys, it is important to consider that the escalation of the government's political violence reflects a social unease regarding the ongoing fraying of labor relations. In the world market by the deepening of informality and widespread job insecurity, the resentment of subordinates against those perceived as privileged extends to the rights of organized labor. In place of unions, informal workers are welcomed by evangelical churches, instrumentalized by the fundamentalist right wing, which, through a theology of prosperity, offer them both spiritual support and the will to work. After all, in order to function in an uncertain and violent environment, the entrepreneurship that typifies the informal economy requires massive doses of self-discipline that, in practical terms, only popular religiosity is capable of providing. Bolsonaro counts on electee affinities with the evangelicals to build an organic base as part of his effort to convert the virtual support that elect him into real reactionary mobilization. In this, Bolsonaro follows an invariable script. He chooses enemies to attack while portraying himself as a victim. Bolsonaro accuses people, but also institutions and the press, as obstacles to his project, contriving a logic of self-fulfilling prophecy. So when the president accuses Congress of boycotting him, he shifts responsibility for his failures to those who Don't let him rule, he said, while at the same time mobilizing popular support to face the institution that, in the eyes of citizenship, synthesizes rotten and corrupt politics. When the Congress reacts, the president's narrative is legitimized, and therefore he raises the tone. When it shuts up, the president advances another square. In this game of inversions, Bolsonaro appears as subversive while the left branches the constitutions in defense of order. Bolsonaro's simply answer to complex problems in Brasilia corresponds on internet channels to the narrative of a hero who faces successive violence. In this logic, the government's achievements do not matter because the rule of political effectiveness is different: to inflame its supporters and naturalize what was, until recently, intolerable. Bolsonaro rewrites what is normal, expanding the aspirational horizon of his base. It is a movement that cannot recede, but on the contrary, only accumulated mass, speed, and violence in snowball fashion. As such, the president summoned his base to demand the closure of National Congress on March 15th. 3 days later, a demonstration was planned by various social movements, unions, and left-wing party activists in defense of education, which, under the circumstances, took on the shape of a counter-demonstration. It is in this context that the COVID landed in Brazil. The March 15th act ended up canceled, but die-hard supporters took the streets and were personally greeted by the president. Against the background of Bolsonaro's negationism, the demonstration of March 18th became a successful national pan-striking. It unexpectedly revealed that Bolsonaro's support is declining among the rich and the middle class, that the first to be hit by the virus that arrived through Brazilians who hold passports. The president responded by radicalizing denial and collect enemies in the process. At each of his speeches, pots ring out of windows. Was the president lost in his parallel world? In the survival calculations of this perverse political animal, any death drive is a political opportunity. It is necessary to seek reason behind the madness. Bolsonaro assumes that the crisis has two dimensions: sanitary and economic. The discourse against horizontal isolation dialogues with those who die of hunger, not of COVID. Bolsonaro correctly assumes that workers want to work. Evangelical leaders whose churches have been empty are also opposed to the social isolation measures implemented by governors and mayors, as are traders and businessmen. The other side of this politics is the certainty that the Brazilian state, concocted under slavery, will never assist workers as in Europe, for instance. On the contrary, legal measures have facilitated wage cuts and layoffs. The new liberal fundamentalism of the economy ministers supports Bolsonaro's political calculation. Obviously, this is a risk bet, which is leading the country to a catastrophe. As Pierre Salamat noted, if fighting the COVID is depicted as a war, then Bolsonaro is a war criminal. In this scenario, the fact that a suicidal and genocidal president is tolerated by the population and by Congress indicated the despair of those from below and the cynicism of those from above. Meanwhile, Bolsonaro doubled his bet. In a government that has more military in top posts, in top positions, than the military dictatorship ever did, criticizing the press, intimidated by the judiciary, harassed by the ruling class, and with his popularity threatened, Bolsonaro contemplated a fui en avant. He announced an emergency aid of 600 reais for more than 50 million people, That is 4 times more money to 4 times more people than the Bolsa Família, the program, the Bolsa Família, the social star of Lulism. Then, surrounded by the military and without the economy minister, he announced a public investment plan opposed to neoliberal orthodoxy. The move was clear: to strengthen direct links with those from below, supported by the military, to the detriment of class solidarity with those from above, a kind of Lulism in reverse. However, the president walks on thin ice. Political turbulence troubles capital and has forced Bolsonaro to retreat, reaffirming full powers to the Minister of Economy. Against the pot striking of his opponents, his electors drive their cars and honk in front of hospitals, opposing confinement and everything in the way of their leader. At the moment, none of these camps have the strength to tip the balance, and the future of the country is held hostage by parliament, the one the president intends to close. Without the strength to do so, Bolsonaro buys his stability through horse trading politics with the large center, a heterogeneous cluster of small venal parties full of love to give in exchange for posts and funds. In short, he does politics as usual. Beyond Brasilia, Brazil became the global epicenter of the epidemic in June, surpassing the United States in daily coronavirus deaths despite notorious underreporting of cases. Studies showed a correlation between the president's popularity, disrespect for isolation, and the collapse of the public health system in several regions of the country. In urban peripheries, isolation is impracticable, while the workers crowd together to receive 600 reais in the banks. In the countryside, the chance for medical assistance is small, and the virus has reached indigenous territories with a potentially devastating effect. In short, the social apartheid as usual. Many hit pots but didn't let their mates go. Others lived in confinement with their servants who did not return to their homes. Companies increased the commissions charged to buy couriers who supply home offices with everything, while the couriers themselves at first protest in vain on empty avenues. The senzala, the slave quarters, revamped as always. However, on the 1st of July, a national courier strike mobilized tens of thousands of informal workers in at least 6 state capitals. The specter of senzala rebellion as always too. Against the indifference of the rich and the cynicism of Brasilia, networks of solidarity blossom in poor communities. An iconic image shows 425 street presidents, so-called street presidents, in a favela in São Paulo who gather in a soccer field 6 feet away from each other to discuss their solidarity campaign in Paraisópolis, here in São Paulo. The Landless Movement, MST, had donated over 2,300 tons of food they produced before June. Thousands of initiatives have been mapped at a grassroots level, completely disconnected from the state, but also from the established left, whose focus is Brasilia. On that front, over 20 impeachment demands were filed against Bolsonaro in the first month of the pandemic, none started by the Workers' Party, who just recently changed its game. The established left seems condemned to irrelevance as never before. Crime has fallen, the sky has cleared up, and birds sing in the windows of the upper middle class. Underneath the calm, suffering is creeping. The economic crisis hits everyone unequally, spreading tension in a society hoping for a future better than the present, but hopeless that it will be better than the past. In Brazil, there will be no Keynesian reflux or a revival of a welfare state that never came true. Instead, the trend towards dispossession will be resumed with redoubled fury amidst a population anxious to return to some kind of normalcy, even if more and more disgust with or without Bolsonaro. Thank you for listening, guys. That's it for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Rui. That was wonderful. I'm going to hold off questions until the end of the presentation. So let us now turn to Patrick Heller, Brown University. Over to you, Patrick. And Patrick, I think, is going to share his screen.
Can you see it?
Yes, I can see. We can see it. And just a reminder that the recording is continuing. So if you don't want to be recorded, except for Patrick, just take your video off. Okay, thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Rina. Thank you for organizing this. And thanks to Nitsan for organizing all of this, the entire SASE conference, and to the staff and everyone who's made this happen. And I just want to begin by saying that I feel very privileged to be able to share this workshop with Rui and Dylan, because their work has informed some of my own thinking on what I'm calling the age of reaction. So I'm very much indebted to them. And I wish I had time to reflect on Rui's wonderful presentation and incorporate some of it into what I have to say about Brazil. And I'll do as best as I can. We have some differences of emphases, but I'll ultimately defer to him. And what I want to do more so than anything else is just try to draw the comparisons between the two cases, and then end with some reflections on what the prospects are for rebuilding democracies that have been very significantly weakened. So the title of the talk is The Age of Reaction. And the simple empirical observation here is that at no time in history since the interwar period and the rise of fascism in Europe and elsewhere have we seen so many reactionary regimes emerge rather suddenly all across the world, right? So in Europe, we have Brexit and the Front National, and we have Hungary, and we have Turkey. In the US, obviously, we have Trump. In Brazil, Bolsonaro. We've got Duarte in the Philippines. And the list actually gets longer. And of course, we have Modi, who is really the first of the truly reactionary regimes to come to power. And it's quite startling that this is happening across so many different democracies, some younger democracies, some older democracies, OECD countries, countries in the global south, et cetera. And so inevitably one imagines that globalization has a big role to play in all of this. And I'm actually going to de-emphasize globalization. I'll come back to it later on. And here my thoughts do converge very much with the arguments that Rui has been making about Brazil. But I really do want to argue for paying more attention to specificity and context and the histories of these cases. And I'm going to actually argue that Brazil and India are different forms of reaction. I mean, we're throwing around a lot of labels these days, et cetera, but I think it's really important to differentiate. And I want to begin by just giving you a quick sense of what makes them so similar. And here's just by the way, if nothing else, the extraordinary thing is the striking similarity in the styles of Modi and Bolsonaro. And I'll say a little bit more about that. But beyond the styles is the underlying transformations in social structure. So just focusing on the presidential election in 2018 that brought Bolsonaro to power, and then the election in both 2014 and then 2019 that brought Modi's political party, the BJP, to power and reelected in 2019. The similarities are absolutely striking, right? So, these are largely upper class movements. Yes, as Rui says, sometimes the upper class is a little embarrassed, a little hesitant to align itself, but it is a marriage of convenience, as he put it very nicely. But what's really shifted in both cases, upper classes by themselves don't win elections, right, in competitive democracies. And what's really shifted in both cases is the role of the middle class, the traditional professional middle class, many of whom supported the PT for many years, all of whom supported the Congress Party in India, and then for various reasons have abandoned these traditional left of center formations. And we have the rise of a new actor, this kind of precarious middle class. Modi himself calls it the neo-middle class, and I'll say more about it in a moment. But it's essentially that class coalition, as well as some inroads into the working class, but it's still largely an upper middle class movement. But it's not just class, it's also about identities, right? So, you know, I think racial politics in Brazil have played a very big role in bringing Bolsonaro to power. I'll show you a map in a moment, but it's very clear whites generally support him more than blacks, and blacks being a majority in Brazil. And then in India, of course, Hindutva, the Hindu nationalist movement that Modi represents, is essentially an upper caste movement, but one that's been able to reach out to what we call OBCs in India, other backward castes. And again, I'll say more about this in a moment. Religion plays a big role in both cases, the rise of the evangelical megachurches and their ability to mobilize support for Bolsonaro, and likewise Brahminical Hinduism in India, both of which, and this goes to Rui's presentation, really push this kind of discourse of self-discipline and entrepreneurship, et cetera, and are real breaks with the most solidaristic versions of Hinduism that were more current under the Congress, and liberation theology in the base communities that were part of the social Catholic organicist solidaristic base of the PT in Brazil. Gender, people don't comment on this that much, but you know, both Bolsonaro and Trump have a huge gender differential in their electoral support. Modi much less so, but gender votes aren't as differentiated in India in general. But you know, Modi certainly pushes a very conservative vision of the patriarchal family, much as Bolsonaro does. And then there are interesting regional differences that I'll come to in a moment. And then the education point is an important one. Contrary to the US, the support for these regimes of reaction comes in general from the somewhat better educated. So that's just to give you a quick snapshot of the social base. And then, you know, I want to underscore that these are classic populisms. You have a strong, muscular, virile, visionary leader. These are men of the people who've, you know, come up through their, you know, bootstrapping. They're up against these politically correct cosmopolitans. Both of them have this kind of discourse that opposes human rights as this, you know, foreign cultural invention. They see themselves as leaders of the people incarnate, and in classic illiberal populist style, they really don't have much respect for democratic institutions. So as we heard from Rui, Bolsonaro has been working hard to bring the military in and to subvert democratic institutions, and Modi has more or less captured the Supreme Court and has been going after the press and liberal intellectuals, et cetera. So these are classic populisms. And in that sense, they're not much different from other populisms. What I think does make them different is the degree of retrenchment that one associates with these particular regimes. And by retrenchment, I essentially mean a number of things, but they're intimately tied to each other. So in both cases, we see a very determined effort to ration the welfare state. And I'll put this in historical context in a moment. So unlike the right-wing populism in Europe, you know, which hasn't really attacked the welfare state per se, in both cases here, there are concerted efforts to dismantle what are, you know, relatively modest welfare states to begin with, but nonetheless significant. There's also a very concerted effort to redefine what the people means, right? I mean, all populists appeal to the people, but in this case, the people has a very branded, a very specific definition, right? So Bolsonaro has this whole language of banditos and leftists, all communist intellectuals, gays and feminists. And in India, of course, the other are India's 200 million Muslims, along with all their liberal urban sympathizers, now called the urban Naxalites, which is basically just another word for terrorists. And many of these liberal intellectuals are now being harassed by the government. Some have been jailed, etc. In both cases, very concerted efforts to revalorize traditional relations of patriarchy, military, religion, a new kind of state corporatism that's being introduced, much more targeted interventions rather than a rights-based welfare state. And what really sets these cases aside and makes them different than the Trumps and the OECD versions of reactionary populism is the resort to violence and vigilantism, right, which is very pronounced. So in India, we've had the RSS running around, you know, lynching Muslims, creating a climate of fear, and Bolsonaro is closely tied to the paramilitaries in Brazil, et cetera. And both sort of have hyped this culture, this rhetoric of fighting criminality and terrorism, et cetera. So just quickly, a map to underscore Bolsonaro's social support base. It's in the South. The North has stayed somewhat loyal to the PT, but it's really in the South that Bolsonaro made a lot of progress, and really in the global cities. Right? And I want to underscore this, right? Global cities have supported reaction in Brazil, and global cities have supported reaction in India. And it's hard to see in this map, but take my word for it. Delhi, Mumbai, and Bangalore, the poster childs of India's globalizing IT, sophisticated economy, et cetera, all voted BJP, right? And I just underscore this because obviously in Europe, the pattern is exactly the opposite, right? The Londons and the New Yorks and the Seattles, the global cities tend to be anti-reaction, tend to support, you know, moderately left of center regimes, et cetera. And I think this has a lot to do with globalization. All right, so what's the story here? And and this is the historical context, right? And I think it's very clear in the Brazilian case, and Rui already said this, but I want to underscore that this reaction comes in the aftermath of a roughly 2-decade period of building up the welfare state, right? And maybe the gains were modest, but you know, this was a heightened period of hyper-globalization, increasing inequality throughout the world. And the two countries in the world that sort of bucked the trend on a large scale were Brazil, you know, where inequality and poverty have come down, where social rights have been extended. Brazil has a more expansive public healthcare system today than the US does. And in India, people forget this because it wasn't quite as spectacular, but during the last Congress regime, the UPA government, the United Progressive Alliance, that government, during that decade, passed countless legislative reforms that significantly built out the Indian welfare state, right? So both Modi and Bolsonaro are, I would argue, reactions to this period of an expanding welfare state, and in particular, an expansion of social rights. So these are elite reactions, but they're refracted through a kind of identity politics, right? I mean, you know, politics, yes, there's material and economic interests, of course, but a la Gramsci, you have to build historical blocks in the ideological realm, and the socio-cultural work that these movements have done is to really resist this kind of destabilization of identities and this threat to traditional status privilege. So the status privilege of urban whites in Brazil and the status privilege of upper caste English-speaking urban elites in Brazil. And the pivotal actor, as I've said before, is the middle class. It had supported in the past a sort of moderate left of center developmental regime, but it's abandoned that. And I would argue in part because of the particular stake that it has in globalization. In a post-industrial economy, you know, the key resource that you want to accumulate is educational and cultural capital. And in many ways, the expansion of the welfare state was a threat to the traditional monopoly that urban elites had over educational and social and cultural resources in India and Brazil, respectively. And so this is part of the reaction. And in discourse, it takes this very dramatic shift from what was a language of rights. So if nothing else, the PT regime and Lulism, rights to this, rights to that, rights was the kind of dominant political cultural discourse of that period. Likewise, in India, during the UPA regime, there was a right to food, there was a right to work, there was a right to transparency. Rights became the sort of dominant political modality, right? And this has been reversed now, and the discourse is about virtue, the discourse is about upliftment, entrepreneurship, self-discipline, all the points that Rui emphasized. And then you have this new actor of the precarious middle class, and this is, you know, a class that saw some upward mobility during the previous period, either through reductions of poverty, or through the relatively decent growth rates that both India and Brazil had in the prior period. And you know, these are still precarious groups. You know, I mean, they're not upper middle class. They're you know, clerks and white collar workers, etc. And they're highly insecure. And of course, as the welfare state came under attack, you know, they get a little nervous and they sort of realign themselves. And we see this very clearly in polls from the Bolsonaro election. The big drop off is when you go from 4 times above the minimum, 2 times above the minimum wage to 2 times below the minimum wage. Just a huge drop off in support for Bolsonaro or support for the PT. And likewise in India, we don't have very good data on occupational categories, but it's quite clear that manual workers in general did not support Modi. All right, and here's just a quick graph, and I apologize, I haven't had a chance to translate it, but it just shows that in this period that we're talking about in Brazil, those who benefited the most from the policies of the PT were the bottom 70%. And it's this kind of upper middle class that saw its incomes drop. And as always, the 1% did extremely well, right? But in purely economic terms, this would explain the reaction. So I'm not going to say much about Brazil here because Rui covered it already very nicely. And again, just to emphasize that it is an economic reaction, unambiguously. That during the short-lived Temer period, which was a very pure form of neoliberalism, there was a very dramatic assault on the welfare state. It wasn't very popular, and these parties didn't do very well, but Bolsonaro picked it up with this kind of new social project that Rui summarized beautifully. And then again, the discursive shift is from a regime of solidarity to one of middle-class achievements, the virtuous citizen being contrasted to the banditos, and crime obviously playing a big part of the story in Brazil. Modi. So, you know, Modi is the story of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, and the RSS, which is arguably the largest civil society organization in the world. And these are the shock troops of the Hindu nationalist movement. Modi sort of perfected his vision of reaction as chief minister in Gujarat, where not only did he become an avatar of neoliberalism, but he also invested in a regime of very deep, systematic, state-enforced social exclusion of all Muslims, right? And the logic behind this was the electoral logic of consolidating the Hindu vote. You know, obviously lower castes and middle castes shouldn't support the upper caste, but in a united front of Hindu nationalism opposed to the Muslim other, he was able to align the upper caste with the OBCs in Gujarat. He was in power for a long time, positioned himself for a run as the president of the BJP, wins at the national level in 2014, initially downplays the rhetoric of what we call communalism in India, of demonizing Muslims, because he understands that capital doesn't want religious riots, right? I mean, religious rioting is not the kind of environment that investors are looking for. So he sort of downplays through his first 5 years in power the communalizing rhetoric and plays up development. But he doesn't get very good results, in part because this is crony capitalism. You know, he's not doing what's good for capitalism. He's doing what's good for the large corporate and financial interests that support the BJP, right? So there's tons of collusion and cronyism and corruption, and growth actually starts to decline. And so in 2018, when it becomes clear that he might lose the election, he reverts to the Hindutva script and starts talking up Hindu nationalism and fears of terrorism, etc. They unleash the RSS, which literally goes around, you know, lynching Muslims who are accused of eating beef or selling cattle, etc., and wins the election, right, with a resounding majority, and immediately implements his new project, which is really to move India from what is a pluralist federalism to an essentialized nation. The annexation of Kashmir, which is the largest military occupation anywhere in the world today. Kashmir still does not have access to the internet, which is extraordinary when you think about it, in the world's largest democracy. And then passing a series of legislative acts that, for all intents and purposes, are trying to denationalize Muslims. So I'm almost done. Rina, you'll dive in if I've gone too far. I just have 2 more slides. So how do we explain this reaction? So clearly an elite that had been ensconced in power for a long time felt threatened by the PT regime, by the UP alliance in India. In India, it's been the rise, the mobilization, the increasing politicization of lower castes. Party politics have always been dominated by upper castes, but in the last 30 years, the lower castes have come up with their own political vehicles and leaders. In Brazil, it's the rise of non-white rural and urban poor in Brazil through the movements and the PT of the 80s and 90s. The expanding welfare state and the expansion of the discourse of social rights threaten the economic position of elites, but also just their traditional status privileges. The story I hear from Brazil all the time, which resonates deeply with what you hear in India, is elites complaining that the airports look increasingly like bus stations, right? Rui's smiling because he knows it well. And you know, the universities, which were all white, all of a sudden have lots of black people, right? And neighborhoods are changing. And it's a similar phenomenon in India, right? It's the sense of these traditional privileged spaces of white or upper caste elite being invaded by the lower caste, the dangerous classes, etc. So a new reaction coalition is formed and broadened beyond the middle class to include the precarious middle class. It's economic, a rationing of the welfare state, sure, but it also has a deep socio-cultural dimension to it, and this construction of a new sense of the nation. And I just want to finish quickly here with a set of contrasts. I know Rui will push back on this, but I'm slightly, and be clear to say, slightly more optimistic about Brazil. Bolsonaro, he's a bit like Trump, right? He's just making it up as he goes along. There's not a lot of discipline. There's not much of a base. There is a strong rights culture in Brazil that's pushing back. The courts have told him to wear a mask, and they've been pushing back on other issues. And of course, civil society did mobilize around the basic income grant to deal with the pandemic, which is, striking in itself. There is a pretty good civil society infrastructure that's still intact. There are limits to white identity politics in Brazil because whites are a minority at the end of the day. And, we don't talk about this enough, but, federalism and decentralization make it much more difficult for the central government to impose its ideological and economic agenda, as Trump is finding out in the US as well, right? Like in India, the problem is Modi himself has massive personal support. He's much more disciplined than Bolsonaro is. The BJP and the RSS, if we want to talk about neo-fascism, one definition of fascism is that you have to have cadres, a lot of really organized cadres. And the BJP has a lot of really organized, very programmatic cadres. There is a majoritarian, Hindus are 80% of the population, right? So you have more room to play with majoritarian politics. As we've seen in the COVID crisis, in Brazil, you are getting pushback, as Rui emphasized. In India, not so much. Because there is tremendous fear of the capacity of this government to yield its powers to repress civil society, although in some parts of the country there has been reaction. Federalism in India is not as strong as in Brazil. Cities in particular don't have nearly the degree of autonomy. And then finally, you just don't have an opposition in India. I mean, the Congress party has completely fallen apart, and the Lok Sabha, the parliament, is completely dominated by the BJP. So it's not clear where the counter movement is going to come from, especially under the conditions of ramped up repression that we've seen during the COVID crisis. So I'll stop there. Thank you. And let me stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Patrick. So let's now turn to Dylan Riley, who's going to take us over to the US.
Okay. So first of all, I just want to thank you, Rina, and to thank Nitsan as well for giving me the opportunity to talk about this stuff. Really, feel very privileged to be part of this panel. Let me just say that basically my talk, in a sense, is going to be less ambitious than the 2 previous ones, in the sense that I'm not really going to propose an explanation of the phenomenon so much as I am going to propose a kind of attempt to conceptualize you know, the phenomenon of in my talk is particularly focused, obviously, on Trump. But I'll make a few comparative comments that I think, you know, do touch on the other two cases in pretty interesting ways. So let's get started here. Obviously, one of the things that has happened recently, and I would say that this tendency has only accelerated in the years since 2017, 2018, when is, you know, a sort of notion that the global turn to the right, but particularly also the rise of Trumpism in the United States, the rise of Trump in the United States, has an analogy in the interwar period. And so I'm just giving you a couple of quotes here. Tim Schneider, our political order faces new threats, not unlike the totalitarianism of the 20th century. Madeleine Albright, fascism poses a more serious threat now than at any time since the end of World War II. John Shattuck, relative strength of liberal democracy in the US is in question. Levitsky and Ziblatt, President Trump exhibits authoritarian tendencies. From a totally different political perspective, Henry Giraud, fascist thought is on the rise all over the world, but its most dangerous manifestation is in the Trump administration. And Jeff Ely, who suggests, you know, that there's a kind of analogy to be made between Trump and the interwar fascisms. So the first thing I want to do, just to give us a little bit of perspective on this, is to try to take this analysis or this analogy seriously and to see the extent to which it works or doesn't work. My position in the first place is going to be that the analogy is actually quite misleading. That in fact, if you want to understand Trumpism as a type of rule, it's important to see it not as a form of fascism, but rather what I'm going to call an incipient patrimonial structure that is linked to charismatic rather than traditional forms of legitimacy, right? So I'm going to argue, using these kind of Weberian categories, that Trumpism is really, the sort of Trump government is really best, the distinctive features of it are best understood as its kind of household characteristics, and not so much in terms of some kind of mass mobilized fascist party regime. And I think that this, to draw this idea out a little bit in a couple of different ways, one of the principal conflicts between the Trump administration, one of the sort of principal points of tension there is obviously between a style of rule that is, you could only say, is directly hostile to the notion of the office as an impersonal position to be occupied by different individuals. I mean, this struggle between rule as office holding and rule as personal loyalty, I think has run throughout the time of the Trump administration. But that's linked to a second contradiction, which is that although Trump's sort of the organization of his staff is a household organization, there is in fact no traditional legitimacy that he can fall back on. He is a kind of charismatic leader, which has certain effects, and I would say that the most important one is his inability really to organize a coherent staff. So in general, I think that if we're thinking about the interwar period in Trumpism, there are 6 really basic differences between the fascist period and Trumpism. And I'm going to go through these. There's a difference in the context of political development. There's a difference in the geopolitical context in which these things arise. There's a difference in the politics of class and nation in which the things arise. There's a difference in the relationship between the leader and the dominant class. There's a difference of regime dynamics, and there's a difference of geopolitical outcomes. So I just want to actually draw the contrast out on these 6 dimensions. And that's basically going to be the organization of the meat of what I'm going to say here. So the first thing I think to realize about the interwar fascist regimes, and I'm speaking obviously in very broad brushstrokes here, but it's important to see that interwar fascism emerged in countries that had a very particular pattern of political development. And I'm really just talking about, for now, just the German and Italian regimes. And that pattern of political development can be summarized in just this way, that in those countries, there was a kind of an anomalous combination of a very strongly politically organized working class with a quite weak and fragmented bourgeoisie. And in a sense, this inverted, the kind of classic story that Marx was telling in the Communist Manifesto, where the bourgeoisie was supposed to give the elements of political organization to the working class. In both the Italian and the German cases, this phasing was in fact reversed, so that the first mass parties were obviously socialist parties, and not just socialist parties in general. I mean, these were socialist parties that were explicitly aimed at the transition, at the overcoming of capitalism. Now, Trumpism obviously emerges in a context that has nothing like this. There is, in particular, obviously replacing the Obama administration, but there is no massive challenge from below of any sort that can be in any way compared to what dominant class political forces faced in the 1920s and the 1930s in Italy and Germany. And so, that has really important consequences for the nature of the political organization that is going to emerge. The second contrast that I think is important to highlight is that the classic interwar fascist regimes emerged among challenger powers in the classic period of imperialist competition, right? So clearly, the rhetoric in the Italian case, the rhetoric of the proletarian nation struggling against an already existing structure of British geopolitical dominance is an important element. Clearly, the kind of what Trotsky actually described as the geopolitical cage that had trapped Germany since its unification. These are sort of fundamental features of interwar fascism that, in the case of the emergence of Trump, obviously have no relevance. This is not a second-class power. What it is the world's dominant geopolitical player. This is not really emerging in a period of what we could call classic imperialist competition, but rather a period of what could be characterized as empire. Now, the third thing I'm going to propose here, and this may be a way that we can sort of start thinking about things comparatively, is that the politics of class and nation, I believe, are really importantly different between the interwar fascist period and the period that produces, Trump. And I just will very briefly go over this. We could think about this, basically you see I'm sort of suggesting this 2x2 table where we think about the relationship of what I think are, in some ways, and in this I very much agree with Patrick's analysis, that kind of somehow the political center of what we were talking about here should really focus in terms of class analysis on the petty bourgeoisie, or what he calls the professionals, and the working class, that it's the intersection of the class politics of these two groups that really is important to look at. And we can think about these groups really as being either nationalist or internationalist, just to be very crude about it. And if we think about it that way, we can think about fascism as a response to a configuration of class and nation interests in which the educated petty bourgeoisie or middle classes is fundamentally becoming increasingly nationalized, and it is facing a working class which is organized in explicitly international terms. And that intersection, I mean, anyone who studies fascism even for a few minutes will see immediately that the reaction against socialism is always also a reaction against an international enemy, right? And it's that intersection of an internationalist working class and a nationalist petty bourgeoisie that really produces, in some ways, interwar fascism. Just to draw out the contrast, the configuration with that produces Trumpism is in fact exactly the opposite to this. What is happening here is a middle class or petty bourgeoisie that is increasingly cosmopolitan, internationalist in orientation, but a working class which is increasingly nationalist. And this, I think, this is my version of the kind of white working class base of Trumpism. Of course, that has other manifestations as well. The Lega Nord would be another example of this kind of thing, the Front National in France, et cetera, et cetera. But that this period somehow is characterized by an inversion of these two broad factors. Now, just to fill in the table here, I've suggested these other two ways of doing it. So I'm actually, in my way of thinking about it, it might be good to reserve the term populism for some combination of these things in which you have actually a nationalist alliance of both working class and petty bourgeoisie. I'm thinking here particularly of Peronismo, I guess. But that this is really a quite different configuration from what we have anyway in the US. And socialism would be internationalism on both fronts. This is just just to give you an idea. This is, in my opinion, the interwar fascism, particularly in its Italian version, can in some ways be understood as a failed populism. And I'm just giving you a little. This is an example of Mussolini's last sort of editorial venture before he launches Il Popolo d'Italia, which will become the kind of broadsheet of the Italian fascist movement. He launches this journal called Utopia, a bi-weekly review of revolutionary socialism. And if you just look down here, just to give you a sense of what Mussolini's politics were in this period, I mean, they're obviously very shifting, but you can see that he's publishing Liebknecht on internationalism and social chauvinism just in a few years before he will make his turn to the right. And I mean, the reason that I'm showing you this is just to suggest that basically, to understand interwar fascism in one sense, what you really have to grasp is why populism was an impossibility. And the reason it was an impossibility, in my opinion, was the fundamentally internationalist organization of workers and the inability of, the fascist movements to really penetrate and organize the working class in that way. So what about the fourth contrast, the relationship between the leader and the dominant class? Now, in a sense, I would say that both fascism and what I'll call Trumpism, although maybe that's not the right term, I'm not sure what to use. Both fascism and Trumpism, they arise in a situation of dominant class fragmentation, in my opinion. Fascism, in a sense, the party has the function of reorganizing what Poulantzas called the power block. But under Trumpism, the fragmentation of the dominant class is reproduced and exacerbated. And important sectors of capital are profoundly alienated by the regime. And I think that the upshot of this that I'd like to emphasize is just that under Trump, the relationship between the regime and capital is actually much looser and weaker than it is in the case of fascism. That is to say, that fascism has a much more tight and organic relationship to the dominant class than does Trumpism. Just show you a figure from Adam Tooze's Wages of Destruction, which shows the rate of return on capital. Just to give you a sense of what the most radical fascist regime actually provided to its industrialists, which is to say, a lot. Finally, or fifth, what are the dynamics? What is the fundamental struggle that kind of shapes the emerging regime? Well, in the fascist regimes, we're always marked by a continuing struggle between party and bureaucracy. And the nature of that struggle basically was one major driver of regime radicalization. More or less, as party followers sought posts and either tried to create entirely new state forms or tried to purge the pre-existing older bureaucracy. But this conflict was this is a central driver of the unfolding dynamics and the tendency toward radicalization of fascist regimes. Under Trumpism, I think the central political conflict in any case is different, as I've already suggested. I think it's useful, again, to understand it in Weberian terms as a struggle between a patrimonial family or a patrimonial household and a bureaucracy. So all of the conflicts that have arisen in the Trump administration in the state, in any case, are basically focused on the idea of office. And they are really conflicts about a group of pre-existing bureaucrats that views their own positions in terms of a loyalty to an objective order of the state, and the Trump administration, which demands personal loyalty and is fundamentally suspicious of any loyalty that goes beyond loyalty to the person of Trump. And this, of course, produces things that are pathological from the perspective of Trump's own program. And the most obvious dimension of this is the fact that, the Trump regime, with the exception, I would say, of Stephen Miller, has sort of systematically alienated and sidelined its most competent and consistent ideologues. And particularly important here, of course, would be Jeff Sessions, but in a sense, even in an earlier form, Stephen Bannon, right? So these figures who in fact have an ideological program are sidelined, not despite their commitment to ideological transformation, I would argue, precisely because of it. Because any commitment to an ideology is intrinsically impersonal in a way that Trump himself is suspicious of. Finally, on the geopolitical side of this thing, obviously the fascist regimes were oriented to a fundamental transformation of the geopolitical order. That was, to a large extent, their main reason for being. You can see that most clearly, right, in Mein Kampf, for example. And Trumpism is not. If it's aimed toward anything, it's the conservation of American power through new means. But I would say more recently, it's just hard to identify any coherent geopolitical program that is coming out of this. So if we want to understand the Trump administration or Trumpism as an ism and its relationship to this interwar fascisms, I think it's important to emphasize these 6 fundamental differences in context, right? This is just, obviously we've all seen these things, worries among the foreign policy establishment about what Trump is doing, dismantling American power, and so on. This is very, very different from what you see in the interwar fascist regimes. So this is the kind of set of contrasts that I've tried to build here. There's a contrast in the context of political development and geopolitics, in the politics of class and nation, in the relationship of leader to dominant class, in the regime dynamics, and in the geopolitical outcomes. So basically, I'm suggesting that we think, obviously, of Trumpism as a form of patrimonialism more than we should understand it as a form of fascism. That's my main contribution, is to offer this new kind of way of thinking about, of sort of typologizing the regime. Now, why is this happening? And here I'm going to be just to speculate on what I think might be one reason behind this. I think it's important just, and this is, I don't want to be terribly reductionist about this, but just to suggest, right, that one issue or one sort of problem that fascist regimes emerged out of is this transition from first to second wave industrial revolution, right? So the party states that emerge in the interwar period in Europe are in part engaged in a process of basically laying the groundwork for the second industrial revolution generation technologies, things that are associated with, obviously, you know, petroleum rather than coal. I mean, to be very, very crude about it. And as part of doing that, of course, they, both of them engaged in a form of development project. And, you know, perhaps more clear in the German case, but also the Italian case, they, you know, there are really new and creative ways in which the state is basically inserted into the economy and is an organizer and funneler of investment for public spending, public works programs that will really lay the foundations for the economic miracles that emerge in both Italy and Germany in the 1950s and 1960s. So this is the kind of economic element of the fascist regime. What is the sort of fundamental economic transition that Trumpism is linked to? I think, and this is just in some ways meant to provoke, but I think it's increasingly, I think after what happened on March 23rd, when the Federal Reserve basically decided to backstop the entire corporate bond market, I think it's a real question. I think you could argue that Trumpism is linked to a transition, not to a new form of capitalism, but to something more like a neo-feudal project. There's no discernible developmental project that is associated with Trumpism. Basically, the role of the state, to the extent that we can understand it, is to shovel handouts to the dominant class. And it's not clear at this point whether, you know, whether we could say bankruptcy will any longer be a phenomenon that characterizes at least firms of a certain size in the new emerging political economy in the United States, right? And this increasingly intimate relationship between the state and individual firms, I'm going to suggest, has a kind of elective affinity with a patrimonial style or household style of rule, right? And so I think that, you know, the emerging political economy that we're sort of that we see growing under our own eyes is not, there's clearly a crisis of neoliberalism here. There may also be a more profound crisis of capitalism itself. And we may be facing a future in which the question will not so much be whether or not we'll have the welfare state or neoliberalism, but rather whether we will have neo-feudalism or something closer to neo-socialism. Okay, so those are kind of my comments. Let me stop sharing the screen.
Thank you so much to all three of you. They were fantastic and very thought-provoking, and I really appreciated the global comparison. I'd like, given the number of people, I think I'm going to turn it over to question and answers, and panelists, obviously, maybe you have questions for each other, which I think we're a small enough group for you to also participate. But if people can use whatever anyone's comfortable with, you can either put your video on and raise your physical hand, type in your question on the chat, or raise your hand icon. So if anyone wants to get us started. Yes, Nitsan.
Thank you all. This was absolutely fascinating and illuminating and quite complimentary in a way, even though you seem to be contradicting each other at times. So I have a question first for Dylan maybe, and then together to Patrick and Rui. Dylan, this was great. the original analogy between Trumpism and the interwar period, of course, is sometimes less analytical and more predictive, right? I mean, it's basically, we know how the interwar period ended, and the analogy suggests that we will, you know, moving in the same direction. And even though I hate when people are asking sociologists to predict the future, I don't want you to predict the future, but I do want to ask you a little bit more about the analytical implications of your suggesting that this is about patrimonialism rather than fascism, especially to go to the very end of your talk. What do you mean by unraveling of empire, right? I mean, by what means, if not by war? I mean, what are the steps that are going to take us there? And also how it relates exactly to the kind of like surprised quasi-economic determinism that you give us in the very end. I mean, do these two things, how do you relate the two things? As in regard to Patrick and Roy, Patrick, the emphasis on the precarious middle class is great and completely convincing, but I don't know if it leads to the numbers. I mean, they still don't have the majority, and you still need the support of the working class in order to get these leaders to get voted. And I wonder if you don't downplay a little bit too much the need and the ability to recruit the working class. And I think this is one of the things that Roy was saying, which is why the question is for him as well. How do you recruit the working class into a project that benefits the middle class in a way? And to what extent this is done not because of the economic issues that you are emphasizing, but other issues?
Yeah, I think we can, because I don't see other questions right now. Why don't you three take that one? And then if I have a million questions, so I'm happy to take up the space, but otherwise, hopefully other questions will also pop up. So maybe Dylan, if you want to start, and then.
Sure. Let me just say, yes. So what's the point of the what's the point of the sort of investigating this analogy in precisely this way? What's the payoff that it gives us? So what I think I would suggest is that if we're trying to understand how this thing is going to unfold, I mean, I want to be very clear about one thing, that my statement that Trump differs in these ways from the interwar fascist regimes is not a statement about, it's not an evaluative statement. I'm not saying this is fine, we don't need to worry about this, right? But I am saying that I feel that the specific dynamics of the regime are or the administration, to put it in more neutral terms, are quite different. And the threat that I think the administration poses is, as I've suggested, a complete unraveling of basically all public goods, and in a funny way, a kind of unraveling of the state itself. Not to say that they're not willing to use violence and all of these other things, but obviously the tendency, I think, and I think where Trump would probably like to go would be a state in which it's the state itself is just basically hived out and dominated by particular specific private interests, not actually capital as a class. I think that Trump's project is actually tending to disintegrate the political unity of capital. I think that's actually an important dynamic that's kind of built into this. And so this particular form of unraveling is likely to be very different than a mass mobilizing war, which in my view, the Trump administration has no capacity to even organize. I don't think they can do this. I may be proven to be wrong. There may be, I mean, presumably as we head into the electoral season, there'll be some attempt at this. I'm very skeptical about their ability even to coherently organize such a thing, even if they wanted to. So I think the threat that we're facing here is a type of collapse which is quite different from kind of mass mobilizing warfare, and it's more just like a pervasive privatization and you know, essentially disintegration of this giant power apparatus of the U.S. state, which is not good. Like, I think we should be legitimately worried about that, but I also don't think that it's anything like, I mean, this is not like Operation Barbarossa, right? That's not on the cards here at all. You know, personally, I mean, if we wanted to take this to the COVID phenomenon, I mean, I think that the fascist regimes would have done much better with COVID than what Trump is doing, because their entire characteristic would be such that they could actually organize, you know, massive lockdowns and impose them and so on. That's not what we're after here. In terms of the political economy piece, I just am struck by, I'm very struck by what's been going on, and even in the most recent period. And I think that we don't really know yet what this new political economy is, but we do know that, you know, in the COVID response has been similar in some ways to the response to 2008, but obviously much more rapid, much vaster, reaching into a far deeper into the sector of private capital. And I just wonder even whether capitalism is the right frame to even understand this new political economy. And it's just kind of a thought, right? I mean, are there hard budget constraints anymore for the corporate sector in the US? I think that's a really open question, because basically what I think you know, they've done is to say, we're not going to tolerate bankruptcies. You know, they've given a kind of implicit guarantee to the entire corporate economy, which I think is really quite unprecedented. So what is this thing? So this is an economy that cannot provide mass employment. This is an economy that does not, you know, surplus, to put it that way, doesn't depend on relative surplus value at all. There's very little investment, right? And, you know, we have this total disjunction now between obviously what's going on in the stock market and what's going on in the real economy. So I just think we need to maybe start thinking more deeply about what sort of political economy this is. I don't mean to be totally reductive about it, but I wanted to raise that point at the end. I hope that answers some of what you asked. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Rui?
It's thank you for your question. Well, I would say firstly that depends on if this new middle class oriented groups, which is basically formed by guys who are working on the informal labor market, trying to build up some sort of, you know, small business stuff and so on. Right now, they are the majority of the population in the country, which counts with something like 60% of the labor force of the country, which is huge. I mean, in the last 5 years, Brazilian society experienced this shift from a vast formal labor market, which was degraded throughout the years. And now we got this informal labor market, which is really huge. We are talking about the majority of the population, or families which form the majority of the populations in the country. But it's true that Bolsonaro, he doesn't got the support. I mean, he does, obviously, because part of these people are supporting him for sure up to now. And his basis, the social basis of Bolsonarism, right now is changing, but still the basis is formed by informal groups, small business oriented guys, etc. But he's losing traction. I mean, he got some sort of troubles. Well, let's split the question in two parts. First of all, why those groups who went to informality support Bolsonaro for the first place? I would say that the trend, the wave of formalization of our labor market, which took some decade and so 15 years during the Workers' Party regimes, the Workers' Party governments, was a formalization process very weak in terms of outcome, in terms of, for instance, the wage, the level of wage were so low that wasn't really attractive. So to give you an idea, during the Lula's government and Dilma's government, Brazil created the structure, the Brazilian structure, the economy create each year 2.5 million jobs in formal labor market, paying up to 1.5 minimum wage, which is really, really low in Brazilian terms. I mean, our minimum wage is really, really low. So when the unemployment rate doubled during the crisis, 2015, 2016, vast majority of those guys who earn 1.5 minimum wage went to informality. And they basically start new business by themselves. I mean, and I interviewed last year in 2019, lots of former outsourced workers, which was a kind of iconic image of the labor market in Brazil during the Workers' Party governments. The vast majority of the jobs that were formed among the subaltern classes were outsourced jobs. I mean, the paying very low and without a strong social protection, because they got no strong unions for, organize them and so on and so forth. And those guys were saying that I was interviewing. I mean, they were saying, well, when I was an outsourced worker, I was earning two minimum wage, 2.5 to minimum wage until 3 minimum wage, more or less. And now I'm doing Uber job. I'm doing an Uber job. I'm working for Uber. I'm working by myself. And I'm despite the fact that my journey of labor is longer than previous job, despite the fact that I need to work in an unprotected job because I don't have payment for vacations or this kind of benefit. I'm earning 5 minimum wage. I mean, I basically double my revenue. I'm doing my own wage, which means that informal jobs in a Brazilian context count. I mean, it's not a very bad stuff. I mean, it's possible to survive, and at the same time, the formal jobs is doing really in a bad shape. I mean, it's not working appropriately. So the issues like concerning about social violence, security, violence against the robbery, against the guys who are, you know, threatening those guys who are working on streets and stuff, counts a lot. And at the same time, in this new gig economy, part of the opportunities to compete in the informal labor market depends on the nets of opportunities, the nets of solidarity, which is provided by the church. So you got a sort of combination, I would say, an elective affinity between the informal conditions of jobs and, on the other hand, the new Pentecostalism or the new Pentecostal church oriented or guided by the theology of prosperity or something like that. So this situation helps us to understand why Bolsonaro counts with the support of those petit bourgeoisie oriented guys who are in real terms informal workers, even precarious workers, I mean, to some extent. So this situation is being reproduced in Brazil since the crisis, 2015, 2016. And we got this particular, I would say, scenario, political scenario, where Bolsonaro counts with the support of those guys who are earning from 2 to 5 minimum wage. At the same time, there is a kind of decline in terms of support in general terms. So he's losing the support from the elites in electoral terms. I mean, he's not doing very well when you see the elites, how stable is the support of the elites, and now he's earning the support from the very poor workers in the country because the program called Renda Brasil.
Rui, I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to make sure I can give a couple minutes to Patrick before we have to close.
Sure. Sorry.
But yeah, no. Just
so he's shaping his social basis, unifying very poor workers and this kind of middle class or petit bourgeoisie oriented guys, despite the fact that he's losing traction among those guys on upper middle classes and the elite itself. Thank you.
Thank you. Patrick?
Yeah, I wish we had another hour. I have so many questions for Dylan and Rui, and it's great. And thank you for your question. It's on just, really quickly. I mean, how do you measure working class? How do you capture how they vote? So first of all, India's a first past the post system. You only need a plurality, and BJP only got 36% of the vote. So, and it's all about local configurations. But, what's really clear is they got no Muslims, and there's 200 million Muslims in India, and Muslims are by and large working class or informal sector. Right. And where they made inroads was the OBCs. And the OBCs are these other backward castes, and they tend to be small proprietors or people who are very aspirational in the informal sector as well. We could call them working class. Modi calls them neo-middle class. But, all the electoral data is really clear. I mean, this is where the OBCs used to support Congress because Congress extended affirmative action policies to them. Now they've sort of abandoned Congress for the BJP, in part because the Congress had supported NREGA, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which increased the wages of rural laborers, and a lot of OBC people are small proprietors who obviously don't want to see wages go up. So, there is a class dynamic, but, as I try to emphasize in the presentation, where the BJP really gets traction is on the identity issues, right? And the OBCs should not be aligning with Brahmins. I mean, Brahmins have monopolized education, and all OBCs are aspirational and they want access to, you know, and this is the one thing that the upper castes are really good at hoarding. And so this is an unnatural alliance made possible by the demonization of Muslims.
Thank you.
We have 1 minute, so I'll stop.
Rina, you are muted.
Sorry, there's no other questions, so I'm going to use my prerogative to throw in one question that obviously we won't have time to answer. But I'm really interested in hearing more about, Dylan, your point and applying it to Brazil and India and the US, your point about the current period showing a weak relationship between Trump and capital. And I'm wondering what data you're using, and I'm wondering if it's useful to not rethink if capitalism is the right frame, but rather to rethink whether income is the right frame and instead look more on returns to capital. So you mentioned stock market's doing well, but the real economy is not doing well. Maybe it's, we focus so much on national accounts and income and GDP, and instead, maybe we need to turn more to looking at return on capital, and return on capital, as far as I understand, is doing quite well. In certainly India, I believe the US, and I'm curious about Brazil. I know we're out of time, but I would love to continue the discussion. I don't know, Nitsan, are we allowed to take a minute or no? You're on mute.
We are allowed to take a minute. You do have to be on the other panel in a few minutes.
Yes.
So yes, I mean, maybe you can conclude the panel for those who need to leave, but whoever wants to stay for maybe 5 more minutes, I think that the tech person will have to shut us down because they have to move on, but 5 minutes is fine.
Okay, so let me first thank our panelists. Thank you very much for really thought-provoking and stimulating presentations, and thanks to all the participants. So with that, we'll close the panel, and we'll, if the panelists can stay for 2 minutes, then we will. Otherwise, I also have to leave. Any quick thoughts?
I just very quickly say that, you know, I think that there's 2 points that I'd like to make. One is that I think that just basically what I'm saying goes to emphasizing how different, actually, maybe the way of thinking about this is that Modi is the most extreme, most close to fascism kind of phenomenon. There's a lot of reasons for that we could talk about. I think that what I was saying is entirely compatible with that perspective, actually. And Bolsonaro is somewhere in between, and then Trump is sort of over here, and there's like a distribution somehow along that, in terms of these 3 different types. In terms of returns to capital, sure. I mean, what I would say is that I think the thing that for me is most important to understand is that those returns are increasingly determined directly by politics, not by investment in the real economy. And if we understand capitalism primarily to be about the production of relative surplus value through investment, we are living in some kind of different world. And it's going to have very different political dynamics. And I think we should probably begin to think about what those political dynamics are, and what the possibilities are for acting politically in a positive way in that kind of environment. So when I say that I think that there's a transformation, what I don't mean to say that people aren't making lots of profits, but those profits are not deriving anymore predominantly from investment and production of relative surplus value. They are deriving basically from relationships to the state. That is going to lead to a much more zero-sum conflict, in my view, between different fractions of this new dominant class as they struggle for control of the state. And at the same time is very, very threatening for the long-term viability of democratic capitalism. I think we're in a very serious kind of fork in the road here.
Can I just add to that, because I completely agree, but I want to connect it to how I see Brazil and India in this comparative picture. You know, Mark Blythe, our colleague at Brown, always says that in the post-73 period, all of government policy is about protecting assets. It used to be about investing in labor and the welfare state, supporting wages and collective bargaining. Now it's just protecting assets. That's what everybody does. And we're seeing it in this COVID crisis, et cetera. And that's exactly why I think, at least in structural terms, the reaction to the UPA in India and the reaction to Lula, as moderate as it was as a redistributive project, the reactions were so severe because there was a slight shift in the function of the state. The state was actually investing in human capabilities, right? In education, access to food in India, raising minimum wages in agriculture, even decommodifying land in the case of India, et cetera. And that was coupled with the identity issues and the loss of privilege, traditional status and access and ability to hoard and monopolize educational resources. That's why the reaction has been so severe. Right?
Okay, I am getting messages. I'm getting messages that we have to shut down, but I think it's fascinating. Obviously, a lot more to talk about. And we also have to talk about tax reform that's been going on through all this. But thank you again to everyone, and let us keep the discussions going. Bye-bye.